Hi, everybody. We're going to start. This is the Bastiat Society. I want to thank you for coming. The Bastiat Society of Raleigh. It is Wednesday, November 13th, 2024. We're at the McGregor Downs Country Club. And I wanted to start a little early because I just wanted to cover a little ground. But obviously, first of all, I wanted to tell you that we're going to have Mitch Kokai here. He's today on essentially what's happening in North Carolina politics now that we've had the election last week. And of course, Ted Hicks is with John Locke Foundation on the board of directors, and we're also lucky enough to have Ted on our steering committee, and he's going to introduce a little bit more about Mitch. But before we go into that, I just wanted to tell you that this is the last Bastiat Society of Raleigh meeting that we're having, but we're going to be reconstituted as the Harwood Salon of Raleigh in January. Our parent organization is called American Institute of Economic Research, and I guess we impressed them because they decided that even though they were going to be shuttering some of the other Bastiat societies around the world, essentially, they wanted to directly sponsor us for the most part going forward. So that's pretty cool, right? Yeah. I mean, we had a very successful organization. And so it's going to be named after Colonel Edward Harwood. He was the guy who in the 1930s decided that he wanted to push back against socialism and FDR's New Deal, and he wanted to promote free markets and sound money, and he started AIER, and that's what the organization is going to be named after. It's going to be named after Harwood. We've had a lot of very successful speakers. I want to thank everyone for being so loyal and coming, and we have you can't see it on the film, but we have this wonderful table of loyalists that have come almost every single time. I just want to thank you very much, call you out for making it. And I wanted to make sure I covered just about everything I wanted to say. Of course, I think it's very fitting that Mitch Kokai interviewed me before we even launched the Bastiat Society of Raleigh. And he's such a great communicator. He was able to, just really put me at ease and stuff. And then John Locke actually put the interview on its website and helped really get things going. So it's really fitting that Mitch is here for the last Bastiat Society of Raleigh meeting. Thank you very much, Mitch. And we're going to kick off the Harwood Salon in January 2025 with our own illustrious Professor Munger. He is here today. And he's going to be speaking on tariffs. Ooh, okay. So with no further ado, Mr. Hicks, would you please come up and do your further introduction of our illustrious speaker? Thank you.
So most of you don't even need the introduction because Mitch is so well regarded and so well known in the area. Mitch, I was noticing, started with WPTF many moons ago, if you even remember WPTF. But Mitch is the senior political analyst for the John Locke Foundation, and he is an invaluable resource to the organization, and I would argue to the freedom movement in North Carolina. So without further ado, Mitch, take it away.
And I really like introductions like that are short and don't go too much into the bio, because most of the things that I put in my bio no one really cares about or needs to know. I also want to thank the Bastiat Society, now the Harwood Salon,
Yes.
For the invitation to speak. And Brad did reference the fact that I have seen this group from before it started, from when Brad was really pushing hard to get it going, was trying to get some interest, was trying to line up some some people to speak and also to play a part in helping to run the group, get some interesting people to come to the events. And so it's been great to see that the group has taken off and has not only succeeded and thrived, but will be continuing on as maybe some other Bastiat Society organizations go away. I also wanted to thank all of you for attending, but throw out some special thanks. I want to throw thanks to my colleague William Allen. Just before coming over here, he and I were in the office in Raleigh talking about coming over here, the drive from North Raleigh, and how long it was going to take, and the fact that William is a huge Carolina Hurricanes fan, has to drag himself away from the game. Although it's a late game, so he probably won't miss it. And I also want to say a special thank you to my neighbors who are attending the meeting for the first time. Charlotte and Lou, thanks for coming from our building up in the North Raleigh area, or actually Hayes Park area. So thanks for coming to this, and I hope you won't be too disappointed. Another thing I want to mention is we scheduled this event some months ago before the election, but knowing it was going to be right after the election. And when I came up with the title, it was something along the lines of what messages did North Carolina voters send in 2024? And the danger of titling a speech like that before the election is, what if they don't send any messages? What if the election comes and goes and you have no idea what the voters said? Then you have to kind of make something up and try to pretend there was some sort of message. I'm not sure that you would look at this election and say there was one clear-cut message, but I do think there are some that kind of come out in the mix as you look at some of these results, especially in the ways that people split their votes from one election to another. And we'll try to get into that, and then we'll have plenty of time for your questions about the elections and what lies ahead. Some of the questions that people were asking beforehand that aren't in the presentation, so I didn't have to say, well, wait for me to do the presentation, had to do with policy issues or the likely impacts for things that will be happening in the new year. That's not really in the presentation here, but I'll be happy to talk about that if people have questions about it. And the other thing I should mention before getting into some of the nuts and bolts is, having seen some of these presentations over the course of the years, most of what you hear at a Bastiat Society presentation deals with theory and philosophy and sort of the deep ideas. That's not really my presentation. It's going to be more numbers and how things turned out, who won, who lost. But I will try to throw in a few theoretical nuggets out there a couple of times, and I will start with this. As all of us free marketeers will say, most knowledge is actually dispersed and local. It's not really known by anyone. Not one person doesn't know all of the things that need to be known to make decisions. They should be made as much as possible at a local level among people dealing with each other freely. And the same could be said to some extent with why people voted the way they did. There are a lot of things that happen on the local level that I am not going to be able to tell you about. The one thing I can think of right off the top of my head, and some of you, if you're here in the Cary area, will have much better information about this than I did. But one of the little sort of sidelights in the election was I noticed that both of the Cary bond packages failed this time around, which struck me as odd. Cary seems like one of these places where you stick a bond up there for Parks and Rec and it's going to pass. Well, it failed, and their bond for housing also failed. There's some story behind why that happened. I don't really have that information. It's not something that, looking at the state level data, that I really knew much about. But that's the type of information that's helpful to know, that can help when you put all of those little local stories together, get a sense of what's happening on the statewide level. So bear in mind that what I'm going to be telling you is kind of more the view from Raleigh about what happened across the state, rather than a great collection of all of the local stories that you would need to know to have the best story of what happened in the election. That said, and that little piece of theory aside, let's get into some of the results. Of course, the big race was the race for president, the one that everyone was paying attention to. And you might remember that in 2020, Donald Trump won North Carolina's electoral votes for the second time. He's now won them 3 times. Should have gone back to check this, but my guess is that probably hasn't been done in North Carolina since FDR. And someone would have won 3 times. FDR, I'm guessing, won 4, since he won 4 elections, and would have counted on North Carolina. But Donald Trump won last time in 2020 by the closest margin of any state that he won. And so that was one of the reasons why Democrats targeted North Carolina as the one that they were most likely to flip if they could flip any of the states. He won by 1.3 percentage points over Joe Biden, roughly 74,000 votes. This time around, far different, in the neighborhood of 190,000 votes, and a margin that as of the end of election night, the morning after, looked like 3.4 points. It's now gone down a little bit, but 3.3 points and change. Still a fairly comfortable win for Donald Trump in this state. His mail-in votes have jumped back in 2016, throwing out kind of the COVID year when a lot more people were voting mail-in than would typically be the case. In 2016, he got 98,000 mail-in votes. This time around, 160,000. If you look at early in-person voting, when he first won in 2016, it was about 1.375 million of those in-person votes, jumped to 1.9 million in 2020, when a lot of people were doing mail-in ballots because of the whole COVID thing. And this time around, it went up again, 2 million. So if you go from 2016 to 2024, it went from less than 1.4 million to 2 million of the early in-person votes, which to me says that the message that Trump had, which had in the past been, don't trust these options other than voting on election day, vote on election day, don't do this early stuff with mail-in. The switch from that message to, yes, vote early, vote by mail if you want, it's all gonna be safe and secure, did play a role in North Carolina. And we know that the Republican Party and their ideologically aligned groups that work on getting voters out to the polls, that was a key thing that they worked on. And their message was, look, we want all of you, especially high propensity voters who normally vote on election day, go out and vote early, vote by mail, because we know that once you vote, we could spend all our time and resources and money on getting the lower propensity voters out there to vote on election day. There was some concern that the numbers early on bared that out, that it was having an impact because the Republicans were doing better and in fact overtaking Democrats in early voting. But there was some concern among pundits and observers that perhaps Republicans were just cannibalizing their election day voting, that all of those election day voters were going to be voting early or by mail, and that there would be hardly anyone left to vote on election day. They would just get the same number of voters that they had before. That, of course, did not turn out to be true. Election day voting is still going down as a share of the total vote, but Republicans still had enough of the election day votes that made a difference for them in that presidential race. Donald Trump, I'll also mention, carried 78 counties. So even though it was a 3-point margin, if you look at it geographically, huge win. That is, of course, because Democrats like to congregate together closely in the larger counties, which is why if you live in a Wake County or Mecklenburg County, it's very hard for Republicans to win because there are so many Democrats who are all closely living together, while the Republicans are more dispersed and tend to win lots more elections across the state by smaller margins, while the Democrats will win fewer total elections, but when they do win, they win big because they have a lot of folks all clustered together. All right, next I will move to Congress. State courts, you might remember, forced on North Carolina a congressional map for the last election cycle that ended up splitting our 14-member delegation to the U.S. House of Representatives evenly. 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans. I say that the courts forced this because if you look at the way the natural geography, political geography of North Carolina plays out, the most likely result in a typical election year, if you drew the fairest maps possible, would probably be an 8-6 or 9-5 Republican advantage. It's just the way, because of the congregation of Democrats so closely together and the dispersal of Republicans, that's the way things would play out. The map that the Democratic State Supreme Court, working through a 3-judge panel and some special masters hired for the job, the way that it played out is that there was basically a 7-7 split, 7 pretty much guaranteed Republican congressional seats, 6 that would be guaranteed for the Democrats, 1 that was kind of a toss-up, and the toss-up that time around ended up going to the Democrats, so we ended up with a 7-7 split. This time around, the General Assembly had a chance to redraw the election maps, drew them more favorably to Republicans, and the courts allowed those maps to be used for this election cycle. Now, there are still 3 federal and 1 state lawsuit that are challenging those maps. There are trials in the federal suits that are scheduled, one in February and a joint trial on the other 2 suits in the summer. The state suit, which is the one that Bob Orr, the former state Supreme Court justice, filed calling for fair elections, that one hasn't been scheduled for a trial. In fact, it's on appeal at this point. But those are still playing out, but at this point, the courts allowed the current congressional map and the legislative maps to be used for this state election cycle. And in this cycle, the expectation going into this election was there were going to be 10 seats that would almost certainly go to Republicans, 3 seats that would almost certainly go to Democrats, and 1 true toss-up district. And the election came and went, and lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. Aside from the toss-up district, the closest race was Chuck Edwards out in the west in the 11th district, who won re-election by 13.5 points. And that was the closest one.
Wow.
Some of them were 25, 30-point margins, especially the Democratic districts, because Republicans, as you might expect, tried to pack as many Democrats into the Democratic districts as possible, so the rest of the districts would be more Republican. That's kind of the way that works. It's what the Democrats do when they're in charge too. They try to make Republican districts as Republican as possible, so the rest of the districts will be more friendly to Democrats. So 10-3, guaranteed. The 1 toss-up district was Congressional District 1. For those of you who don't follow this stuff that closely, that's why that was the only race where you saw any commercials, because no one else even bothered. But the Congressional District 1 race was really hotly contested between the first-term Democratic incumbent, Don Davis, and the Republican challenger, Lori Buckout. They both ran a ton of ads, did a lot of campaigning, and it was very close. Don Davis won, although he did not get to 50% of the vote. He was just shy, 49.46%. Buckout was at 47.9%. About 5,800 votes separating the 2 of them. And it's important to note that there was a Libertarian candidate, which is why the winner had less than 50%. The Libertarian candidate, Tom Bailey, had about 2.5% of the vote, or about 9,800 votes. Now, and I'm looking at our former Libertarian candidate for governor, who was a candidate in the legislature, I believe, for the Libertarian ticket this time. When I say this, some people will see a race in which a Libertarian is on the ballot and the Democrat ends up beating the Republican, and they'll say, well, you know, if the Libertarian hadn't been in there, the Republican would have won. Why do they do this? And play spoiler. There may be something to that, but it's not that clear cut. I can't speak to the District 1 race. But it is possible and likely in a number of cases that some of the people who were voting for a libertarian candidate in this race and others weren't gonna vote for either of the other two candidates. They are libertarians and they are not gonna vote for a major party candidate, and they voted because they had the libertarian option. It's also not true that the libertarians only take votes away from the Republicans. There is a split. Libertarians take votes from Democrats, they take votes from Republicans as well. So I don't think we could say Tom Bailey ended up costing Lori Buckout the election. Tom Bailey probably took some votes that would have gone to Buckout, he probably took some votes that would have gone to Davis, and he probably had a number of votes of people who wouldn't have voted for either of the major party candidates, but were happy to be able to vote for a libertarian.
You might be able to say the Protestants cost for
It's entirely possible, and we aren't yet to that piece of it, but yes, we're gonna get to Mark Robinson and his impact coming up. And for those of you who didn't hear, Ted back there said you might say that Mark Robinson caused her to lose, and that is potentially true. People who do not like the Republican candidate for governor may have taken that out on some other candidates, but we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Before we get away from Congress, even though I mentioned that the races were pretty much decided once the maps were done, one thing that's also significant is despite the fact that races weren't close, we have 5 new members of our congressional delegation, all Republicans. 6th District, Addison McDowell. In the 8th, Mark Harris, who you might remember from a couple election cycles ago, won an election that was thrown out and then did not run when they had a new election because of a big vote buying scandal down in the southeastern part of the state, which was part of his district, even though he was in Charlotte and his district was mainly in the Charlotte area. And if you want more details on that, we can talk about it in the Q&A. 10th District, Pat Harrigan is new. 13th District, which encompasses some of the triangle, Brad Knott. And then in the 14th District, our outgoing Speaker of the State House of Representatives, Tim Moore, will be the new member of Congress there. Message from these votes, one of them is the maps matter. I mean, obviously the maps matter. Another one is that who draws the maps matters, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, also whether the courts will allow the General Assembly to draw the maps. What we know now with our current state Supreme Court and with the current makeup of the federal court is that the courts are not going to be dealing anymore with cases that deal with what's called partisan gerrymandering, or what used to just be called gerrymandering. And that is this notion that the maps are too political, too partisan, and so they have to be thrown out. The courts have basically, at both the federal level and now the state level, said, we can't decide that. Well, what's the standard? What is too political and what is not? That's a political question. If you don't like how it's done, vote the people out. You could do that even if you don't like the maps. Republicans in this state often point to the fact that they won control of the General Assembly in 2010 under Democratic maps. So it can be done if you have strong candidates and if the people don't like what the folks in charge are doing. Let's see, any other message from the congressional races? Yes, I already mentioned that there's federal and state cases still out there. All right, now we're going to get to the area that Ted was alluding to, because we're going to talk about the Council of State. For those who don't follow North Carolina politics particularly closely, and I'm guessing if you're coming to this event you do, but so I apologize for explaining what you already know. But our Council of State, the 10 statewide elected executive branch officials, so there's the governor, lieutenant governor, I won't list them all, but well, we'll end up talking about them all unless I go through the presentation, but there are 10 of them. Going into the election, Republicans held 6 of those seats, Democrats 4. After the election, it's now 5-5. The Democrats flipped both lieutenant governor and state superintendent of public instruction, while the Republicans flipped state auditor. So they ended up, after that, having an even split in the members of the Council of State. The Council of State is significant for a couple of reasons. One, because all of these people, other than really the Lieutenant Governor, whose powers were stripped years ago and doesn't have a whole lot of power, all of the rest of those Council of State members do run state agencies. So they have staffs, they have some independence from the governor, and really answer mainly to the General Assembly that sets their budget. The other thing that's significant, and this is a fairly recent change, for years and years, the governor had a lot of emergency powers that he or she, in the case of Ben Perdue, could invoke to do all kinds of things, but the COVID shutdowns that Governor Cooper had really prompted the General Assembly to say, does this make sense to have one person have this much power? And so they changed the law so that the governor could issue emergency declarations, but they had a shorter lifespan. One of the things that Roy Cooper did was he would have an emergency declaration and then just extend it, and there was no real check on that, except eventually he decided, okay, I better scale some of this back. I guess he was hearing some blowback, and there were some lawsuits that started to be filed over this stuff. The General Assembly changed the State Emergency Management Act provisions so that after a certain period of time, there has to be buy-in and not just call them and go, hey, what do you think about this? But an actual vote by the Council of State approving extending an emergency beyond just a matter of days. And then past a certain point, to keep an emergency in place, the General Assembly has to act. Now with the Hurricane Helene response, there's not going to be a problem with that, at least for a while, in that shortly after the tropical storm rolled through and did all of its damage and destruction, the General Assembly came back to town, passed its first of two so far hurricane relief packages, and part of that first package was saying, okay, the emergency that we have now, we're extending it through the beginning of March. So at some point in the new legislative session, they'll either extend it again or there'll be debate about whether to extend it again. But that was one consequence of what happened during COVID, was that the rest of the Council of State and the General Assembly now play a role in dealing with emergencies after one that just lasts a couple of days. Like a hurricane goes through really quickly, does its damage, it's gone. Kind of the ones that we see on the coast that will cause damage, but people start to clean up relatively quickly. A governor could declare an emergency, and by the time the emergency conditions are over, there's no need for additional action. But something that lasts longer is going to need buy-in from more than just one executive branch official. And if it's something that really is going to last a while, it's going to take the action of the General Assembly. So all that to be said, the biggest race, of course, in the Council of State was the governor's race. And this was a wipeout. The Democratic Attorney General Josh Stein beating the Republican Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson by 15 points, 55 to 40, more than 810,000 votes. I can tell you that I talked probably maybe a week and a half before the election, to a Democratic insider who was very closely involved in this race for Josh Stein. Even they didn't think it was going to be that big. Polls had showed it was going to be that big, and we do a poll at the John Locke Foundation, the Carolina Journal poll. Our last poll in this race had Stein winning by 13.5 points. But when we talked about this, and when I talked about this with this insider, even he thought, yeah, it's not going to be that big. They were thinking at most 8 or 9 points. But no, it was 15 points. The 40% was the floor. Mark Robinson was at least 7 or 8 points lower than even the other losing Republican statewide candidates. Voters, of course, clearly didn't want Mark Robinson. His problems had already started in the polls before the big CNN blockbuster story. The hammering of the ads about what he said about abortion, what he said about people need killing, all of those things had already started to have an impact. He was falling, and then there was the big CNN report about things he had said, which he still denies, on pornographic websites 15 or more years ago, and that basically cratered his campaign. One of the interesting things about this race is you would normally expect someone wins a 15-point margin and they have a clear mandate. I don't know that Josh Stein's going to be able to say that this time around. Mark Robinson was such an outlier in every other way that it's going to be hard for Josh Stein to say that people really voted for me and for my policy prescriptions, and not have people just come back and say, no, people were voting against Mark Robinson. They did not want him in office, regardless of what they thought about your policies. Rest of the Council of State, I mentioned the flip. I put the 9 other Council of State races in about 3 categories. First were the 3 incumbents. I should mention that one of the things that you typically see in these Council of State races is that there are a bunch of incumbents running for re-election and they tend to win. And occasionally you'll have an open seat and that'll be interesting. This time around, a bunch of open seats. Of the 10 races, only 3 of them, by the time we got to the general election, featured the incumbent who had won the election in 2020. Only 3 of them. And I lumped those 3 together because they all had kind of a similar result. Those incumbents who won last time around won this time around. Steve Troxler, the Ag Commissioner, won by about 8 points. Mike Causey, the Insurance Commissioner, won by more than 4 points. And Elaine, both of those are Republicans. On the Democratic side, Elaine Marshall, the Secretary of State, won by almost 2 points. My guess is if this had been a strong Democratic year rather than a stronger Republican year in North Carolina, Marshall might have won by 5 or 6 points. Causey might have won a close election, or maybe it would have gone the other way, but he probably would have won a close election being the incumbent, and Troxler would have won by 4 or 5. It seemed like if you were an incumbent and people didn't really have a bad notion of how you had worked in office. In Causey's case, despite the best efforts of the News and Observer, which had a series of stories for a while about kind of questioning Mike Causey and his work as Insurance Commissioner. But if you were an incumbent and it seemed like you were doing a decent job, people voted you back in. I could give you one anecdote on that. I have a friend, early 30-something single woman, describes herself as very conservative, but she voted for Elaine Marshall because she said, you know, I kind of treat that as like a Supreme Court seat. You keep that job until you die unless you do something really bad. Okay, so, I mean, she voted, I think, probably didn't vote for Robinson, but voted for Republicans pretty much up and down. But Elaine Marshall, she's like, all right, that's her job, let her keep the job. But every time Elaine Marshall wins, I think if the king, Richard Petty, couldn't beat Elaine Marshall. Remember, she won this race for the first time when she beat Richard Petty in 1996. If the king can't beat her, who's going to beat her? But this race and her last race were the closest ones. In fact, you might have seen some Elaine Marshall TV ads, and I thought that was kind of interesting. And probably her polling showed that it was closer than she would have liked, and that's why she ran some ads. So those were the 3 incumbents. The next 3 that I grouped together, I call kind of the low-key open seats. These were ones where you didn't really hear a whole lot about either of the candidates. There didn't seem to be a whole lot of excitement about them. And in each of these races, the Republicans won. Looking at the auditor's race, where there was an incumbent, but it was an appointed incumbent. The old auditor, Beth Wood, you might remember, got forced out of her job. She had a scandal after a Christmas party, drove her car on top of another car in downtown Raleigh, which is, I mean, it's not like this was on 40 or something. If you're driving on another car on a street that's 25 miles an hour speed limit, you're doing something kind of interesting. So she got forced out of office. Governor Cooper appointed Jessica Holmes to be the new auditor. But in this case, this is the one where the Republicans flipped it. Dave Bullock won that race by 1.9 points, about 104,000 votes. The other 2 races that I group among these kind of low-key races were the ones for Labor Commissioner and Treasurer. And in both these cases, the Republicans won fairly comfortable. Luke Farley by 5.5 points, and Brad Reiner by about 5 points. So we've talked about the three incumbent races, the three kind of low-key races that Republicans all won. And then the other three I would call the high-profile open seats. And these were high-profile for one reason or another, and Democrats won all three of these. One was the lieutenant governor's race, where you had Rachel Hunt, daughter of the former four-term Democratic governor, running against Hal Weatherman, who had been a chief of staff to Dan Forrest. I was thinking of the former lieutenant governor, the guy who didn't like masks, who in 2020, when he ran for governor, being the guy who didn't like masks, didn't help him. Dan Forrest had also worked for Sue Myrick. Hal Weatherman, talking about ties to Mark Robinson. Hal Weatherman was a guy who had buttons printed up, Robinson and Weatherman. He had signs, Robinson and Weatherman. So he's certainly going into the campaign, was kind of treating this as, let's vote for a team, even though you vote for the governor and lieutenant governor separately. Weatherman probably paid at least some price for being tied in voters' minds to Mark Robinson. Hunt won that race by 1.7 points, about 96,000 votes. So the Robinson tie-in could have made a difference there. The Attorney General's race was kind of high profile for a number of reasons, one of which is that both candidates were members of Congress who decided they wanted to leave DC, come back and be the top official in law enforcement in North Carolina. As a little bit of historical background, North Carolina hasn't had a Republican Attorney General since one was appointed briefly in the 70s. North Carolinians haven't elected a Republican Attorney General since the 1890s. I think Republicans thought they had a good candidate in Dan Bishop, kind of a Republican member of Congress, fairly well known in conservative circles. It ended up, he had announced fairly early on, ended up running against another member of Congress, Democrat Jeff Jackson, who a lot of people know as the TikTok guy. He made his name once he got to DC of doing a bunch of TikTok videos about things happening in Congress. And as the campaign went on, basically Bishop's main pitch was Jackson's too liberal. If you saw his main ad, it was, look, he accepted this award from this child predator. Why would you want to make him the AG? On the other side, Jeff Jackson's ads were mainly, hey, this Dan Bishop guy is a nutty right-winger, and he wants to be Mark Robinson's sidekick. And Bishop, who had no primary, went out of his way to say that he wanted to tie himself to Mark Robinson. So he sort of gave the fodder to Jackson for that. And if you remember, one of the ads that Jackson ran was talking about how extreme Dan Bishop was, and then at the end saying, and I'm basically running to be a normal guy. That probably made some difference. Jeff Jackson ended up winning that race by 2.7 points, about 150,000 votes. Clear win, but certainly it could have gone the other way had this been treated the same way as the labor commissioner race or the treasurer's race. Republicans won those by 5 points. In this case, Bishop lost by 2.7 points. And then the last one that I would put in that high profile open seat category was superintendent of public instruction. And the only reason it was an open seat was because the Republican candidate knocked out the incumbent in the primary. We had Catherine Truitt as the second straight Republican superintendent of public instruction. She lost in the primary to Michelle Morrow, who is an activist, homeschool parent, really critical of the education establishment. In the Republican primary, that really helped her because a lot of Republican primary voters saw Catherine Truitt as too tied to the education establishment, too responsible for all of the problems that happened with the public schools during and after COVID, wanted to see something different. That succeeded for Michelle Morrow in the primary, did not help her as much in the general election, especially when she got branded as being extreme, There were old social media posts talking about lining up Barack Obama and other Democrats before firing squads. That didn't help her. And this race also was one that was not a blowout for Democrats, but it was a win for them. Mo Green, who part of the education establishment, he had been a superintendent at Greensboro, an assistant or associate deputy superintendent in Charlotte Neck Schools, and then after doing that, had been the head of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, grant-making group funding lots of left-wing outfits in North Carolina. He ended up winning by 2.2 points, or about 120,000 votes. So 3 separate outcomes there that end up producing a 5-5 even split on the Council of State. Messages there, ties directly, I'll answer your question in just a moment, but ties directly to Mark Robinson, or maybe even to some extent, the Make America Great Again, MAGA brand might have hurt some of those candidates. I think there could be debate about the extent to which that happened, but certainly the candidates who seem to be most tied to Mark Robinson, who were below him on the ballot, did not fare as well as others who had less of a tie. And there has been some sense that maybe being a boring candidate in North Carolina is helpful in the general election. There's been some argument, and not in the sense that the person is personally boring, but just doesn't have a lot of baggage going into the election. Now your questions.
Well, one question, one comment. So the comment is, I believe Michelle Morrow, although she lost that election, has been tagged for a role at a federal level for education. So interesting, she lost here, but she's going to go up to DC and do stuff there. You talked about maps when you started your conversation. My understanding is that the state constitution states that our maps are supposed to be along county lines, but they're not. So how do we not have districts and things that are aligned along county lines as our constitution states we should have?
Okay, probably everyone heard what he said, but first of all, the first comment was Michelle Morrow lost the election and working for the Trump administration. I don't know if anything about that has been confirmed at this point. Last I saw, she was looking at getting a job with the Trump administration in education or in some other role.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's confirmed yet.
Right, and I don't know.
She's speaking about
Right,
it.
she's putting it out there, and my guess is that she would be looked on favorably by Donald Trump and whoever is making the selections for him. But I have not heard that there's definitely been a job yet. So watch and see. That losing that election may not be the end for her. You have some thoughts on that, or is it another question?
No, another question.
Okay, well, and I'll get to questions. I'm gonna talk about the maps first, then kind of finish the other races, and then we'll get to all the Q&A if we have. I think we're on good time right
Yeah,
now.
we got about a few, like 2 or 3 minutes, and then we gotta wrap it up.
And then get to Q&A or wrap up the whole thing.
No, we just got 2 or 3 minutes for your talk, and then we got about 15 minutes of
Okay.
Q&A.
Well, let me wrap up the talk, then I will do the maps, and then I'll get to your question. Okay, so I will keep the General Assembly quick. I had more on this, but just for brevity's sake, after the election, you know that especially with the Democratic governor, it's important for the General Assembly, for Republicans to have, if they want to get something done that is conservative, to have veto-proof supermajorities. That means at least 30 seats in the Senate, 72 in the House. At this stage, it looks like there are 31 seats in the Senate. There's a possibility they could lose one in Wake County, but that would still leave them with 30, which would be the supermajority. On the House side, though, they're 1 vote short. 71 votes for Republicans, 49 for Democrats, which is exactly where they were at the end of the election last time. The only reason they had a supermajority during this last session is that one of the Democrats, Tricia Cotham in Mecklenburg County, flipped from Democrat to Republican. And Tricia Cotham, by the way, running in a new, more Republican-friendly district, did win re-election. And I will leave the rest of the commentary about the General Assembly to the side, and if you have questions about that, we'll certainly get to that. Quickly, the other two things I want to mention that were important on the statewide perspective. It looks like for the third straight election cycle that Republicans swept the statewide judicial races. Jefferson Griffin, appeals court judge, running against appointed Democratic Supreme Court Justice Allison Riggs, won by a very close margin. He had 50.07%. It's about 7,800 votes. There's been talk that Riggs might call for a recount. Even if she gets a recount, she's not going to make up 7,800 votes. You might remember that some years past, there was a recount because we had the Chief Justice's race, which was separated by 401 votes, and that outcome didn't change. Paul Newby won that race. Jefferson Griffin, unless some trove of votes that causes a huge outcry comes out in favor of Allison Riggs, Jefferson Griffin will be the new Supreme Court Justice. Republicans will have a 6-1 majority. They will be playing offense again in the next election cycle when the only seat up for grabs is the one Democrat. And they also won 3 races on the Court of Appeals. Right now they have an 11-4 majority on the Court of Appeals. It would have gone up to 12-3 because they won and knocked out a Democratic appointee. But since Jefferson Griffin will be moving from the Court of Appeals to the Supreme Court, Josh Stein will get to appoint the new member of the Court of Appeals, and he may either appoint Carolyn Thompson, the person who just won, or who just lost, who had been appointed by Roy Cooper, or he might appoint Allison Riggs, who Cooper had appointed to the Court of Appeals before he appointed her to the Supreme Court, and he'll give her another 2 years to try to win an election. And he might pick someone else out completely. And then the very last thing in the presentation is we had the one statewide constitutional amendment on the ballot, and 78% of people said, yes, only citizens should vote, and let's make it clearer in the Constitution. It was already in the Constitution, but the language was a little squirrely, and I think there were some who said some activist judge or some local government somewhere might try to read into the existing language that non-citizens could vote. Let's make it as clearly stated as possible in the Constitution that only citizens could vote in North Carolina, and 78% of people agreed with that. Now I'll wrap up that point. We'll get to your issue on the maps, and then we'll get to your question and any others we have time for. Yes, the Constitution does require that in drawing maps, you can't split counties any more than you have to. But there are requirements from other court cases that say that districts have to be about the same size, which means you can't have, Wake County be a district and Jones County be a district with their hugely different populations. So the way that this plays out is when the General Assembly draws districts, they come up with, if there's a county that has the right size for a district, it's a district. But if as in almost all parts of the state, the counties have populations that don't completely align with the size of a district that you would need, you combine the counties in clusters and then split them. It's very complicated. In the northeastern part of the state, they have a bunch of counties that are small counties put together, and they make 2 districts out of them. And whichever way you slice up the districts, they look kind of funny, but it's the way that the Constitution requires them to draw those maps. Those are for the legislative districts. For congressional races, there's an even tighter requirement that the districts have to have the exact same number of people, or at least that's the way the General Assembly has interpreted it to try to win any court battles is, hey, you say these districts, 1 man, 1 vote, we're gonna say that they have the exact same number of people, and that's why they can go in and kind of slice and dice things one way or another. There's also been in the past the requirement of having to draw majority-minority districts. That has been less of an issue this time around, and it may or may not be an issue going forward depending on how these active court cases go forward, because the 3 cases that are moving forward in federal court are all racial gerrymandering cases, saying that what the General Assembly did was unfairly target minorities, and so if the courts side with the plaintiffs in those cases, the return of majority minority districts and having to draw those first and then adjusting all the other districts, that would come back again, but that remains to be seen. So that's why the districts aren't just county lines. All right, your question, sir.
Word title would be the election process, the subtitle would be vetting. 2 million votes is a lot of votes for Robinson. And wasn't somebody on the Republican side vetting this guy?
Yes.
In terms of, you know, as a voter of him, I felt sandbagged. You know, the carpet was pulled out. Like, didn't somebody know this? Didn't you know, he's not going to admit, or has not admitted anything yet, but if CNN can get it, anybody could get it. It was very disappointing from that perspective. That, and the timing, of course, was perfect. The ad was
Right, the timing was done by design
Yeah,
to
of
affect
course.
the election, and I know that there were many people within and outside of the establishment who said, the bad stuff on Robinson is coming out, and we know Stein's people have it, and and this was back in late 2023, early 2024,
and they
saying,
wanted to dissuade Robinson, or was there any way of doing that?
well, I'm sure there were some people who were talking about that, but you'll remember there were two other alternatives in the Republican primary, and it went nowhere. Dale Falwell, the outgoing state treasurer, would tell anyone who would talk to him, Robinson's got problems, just look, I mean, that was part of his campaign. It was, elect me because I know how to fix things, but also don't rely on Robinson, and he would point anyone who would ask him to the various problems that Robinson had. Now, no one outside of the people who were involved in the election knew about the pornographic website stuff. But all of the things about Mark Robinson not showing up to work, all of the things that he had said in public about abortion, about women, about killing people, all of that was public knowledge. And I don't know the details, but a number of people after this election said, heck, I thought it was going to be this 911 call. Apparently there's something about a 911 call involving Mark Robinson that people thought was going to come out at some point that never did. But there were lots of things out there, and for one reason or another, and I'm not enough of a Republican insider, I'm unaffiliated, work at a think tank, but there was something that was driving that train forward, and the people who could have said no didn't.
Chose not to.
So, two things. One, I think both of the candidates, Dale Falwell and Mark Walker, were both trying to get the story out there that Robinson is not going to win. I can't speak to Mr. Graham because he technically was a candidate too, but I don't know anything about him. But both Walker and Falwell were trying to convince Republican primary voters that Robinson has baggage. I would contend that they started getting that message out way too late. Robinson already had a treasure chest, he already had name recognition within the party, it was just way too late. But
They didn't provide any specifics.
what?
They didn't provide any
In
specifics.
closed settings, they were providing specifics, but one of the candidates, I was talking to one of those candidates, and I was asking, how do you get this message out without you yourself coming across as a scumbag for releasing it? Right? Because if you know it, it's eventually gonna come out. Man, you're just a lousy human being for being the one on the right that's actually bringing it up, but somebody should have brought it up a little bit more boldly. But some of those primary candidates, they couldn't raise enough money to get some of that message out. So anyway, my question for you, Mitch, is in Cary, like you said, the bonds lost. When I read those, amendment or questions or whatever, I think at the very beginning of it, it said this may raise your property tax. And And all the other bond referendums that I remember voting for, I don't ever remember it saying anything about property taxes being raised. Are you aware of some statute which would make sense that if you're gonna pass a bond referendum, you need to remind people that are voting on it, by the way, property taxes might go up eventually? Are you aware of anything like that?
I don't remember it off the top of my head, but I know there had been discussion about that, and that's possibly something that did play a role there. I mean, if not, the people of Cary, if they don't have to do it, you know they're not gonna do it again, because the bond went down. But my guess is, that had to be part of the requirement for putting the message on there. Now, bonds passed elsewhere, but seeing Cary's go down was surprising to me as someone who had paid, don't live in Cary, and didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it. And that stood out to me, because this is a community you would guess that normally passes bonds for anything that isn't seen as way outside the norm.
We have time for maybe 1-2 more questions. Lee?
In this last election, every Republican candidate who agreed was accused of being, against abortion with absolutely no exceptions, even if they were. Thoughts on how well that succeeded in this campaign?
I think it fired up some of the Democratic activists, but it didn't fire up enough of them, apparently, because their turnout was nothing to be excited about. I think abortion probably played a role in Robinson's case only because it was hammered in those ads, and it was him. It was him, and he wasn't sitting there saying, well, you know, I don't believe in abortion. It was, you can't keep your skirts down. I mean, he's shouting and yelling, and that I think, even regardless of what he was saying, turned some people off. Just seeing this guy who's screaming at a camera, and you want to be the governor? And I think that turned some people off. But in terms of its impact, maybe here and there in some close races, yes, but otherwise I don't think it made a major difference.
Yeah. Sir, doctor. How are you?
Mitch,
Yes, sir.
I care deeply about certificate of need,
Yes, you did.
and I believe the Supreme Court.
Almost didn't recognize you without the beard, but with the beard.
Sent the case involving Jay Singleton back to court, local court. What's the local court gonna figure out? If it's fair, if it's unconstitutional?
So the question is about North Carolina's Certificate of Need law, which is the law that requires healthcare providers to get basically a government permission slip if they want to build a new hospital, add hospital beds, buy some pieces of medical equipment. Basically, a lot of things that probably should be decided by the free market. Back in the 70s, the state Supreme Court struck down our old Certificate of Need law, and the General Assembly came back and wrote another one. He mentioned Dr. Jay Singleton, who was a New Bern eye surgeon who went to court to challenge the Certificate of Need requirements, saying, look, I can do these eye surgeries in my center. It's got everything it needs. It passes all kinds of inspections. Why do I have to go to this hospital down the road, or send my patients down to this hospital down the road, where they're gonna have to pay 3-4 times as much for these surgeries than they would if they just came where they want to come, which is my Singleton Vision Center. Lower courts have thrown out his case, but the state Supreme Court unanimously sent this case back to the Court of Appeals and said, look, you need to reevaluate this case in light of what we have just recently said in some other cases involving what's called a quorum claim. And in North Carolina, it's a case, quorum versus the Board of Governors of UNC from back in the early 90s, I believe, that said that if there is a violation of a fundamental state constitutional right, and you have no other recourse from government to address that violation, then you have a right to sue the state to address your violation. And back in the summer, the state Supreme Court also unanimously, and this is with the 5-2 court, 5 Republicans, 2 Democrats, also unanimously in the case of Kinsley versus Ace Speedway, said that the owner of an Alamance County racetrack could move forward with his lawsuit claiming that Governor Cooper shut down his track only because the Speedway racetrack owner was criticizing Cooper's approach to the COVID shutdowns, or to COVID policies. And that's the only reason that his Speedway got shut down. That case is now going to be able to move forward, and the Supreme Court set forth a test of what you do when someone has one of these quorum claims, and they're saying, okay, lower courts, look at Singleton's case, look at what we said in the Ace Speedway case, and see if he has a valid claim for having his complaints about the con process be addressed through a quorum claim. So there's still work to be done, and I know that the lawyers that Dr. Singleton is working with the Institute for Justice would have liked the state Supreme Court to say, no, we're just throwing this law out. They didn't do that, but they did allow the suit to move forward and allow Dr. Singleton to proceed with his claim that the con process itself, trying to go through the years of getting the certificate, spending all the money, fighting all the competition, that process in and of itself violates his fundamental right to earn a living. And if he can prove that, then that would effectively kill con. But it's still gonna take a while for the court to deal with that.
Okay, one quick one.
Just quick, do you think that Squire Stein has a vocabulary larger than 4 letters? Or alternately, can we somehow influence Bream Office Supply or the contractor for the office supplies for the governor's mansion to lose all red pens? In other words, does he only know the word veto, as Roy is limited in his education to use?
Stein's a smart guy. I mean, he's left of Roy Cooper politically, but he's a smart guy, and what remains to be seen is, does he choose to take a different path than Roy Cooper, in the sense of Cooper came in, and partly because the Republicans goaded him into it by some of the things that they did, but Cooper decided, I'm just gonna fight these guys, try to end their supermajorities, and then make them work with me. Stein doesn't have to deal, it seems at this point, with the supermajority in the House, so he may adopt that same let's fight policy, or he might say, okay, there are things we're gonna disagree on, we're gonna fight on those, but on most things we'll work together. I think probably the biggest test of that will be during the budget process. During the time frame when Cooper was in office and Republicans had no supermajority, we didn't have a new state budget. Actually, it wasn't a big problem because during the end of the McCrory administration, the law was passed and McCrory signed it that said, if there's no new state budget, the old one stays in effect. And if you are conservative budget-wise, you kind of like that, because it means they don't come together with a deal to spend a whole lot more new money. And the way that things have been spelled out in past budgets that are laws on the books, our tax rates are going to continue to go down. As long as they hit revenue triggers, the tax rates are going to go down even if they do nothing. So if if Stein fights the General Assembly on the budget and they don't end up with a budget, my guess is that Phil Berger and Destin Hall say, okay, and go home and enjoy the rest of their summer and fall, and let the tax rates fall. And they'll pass bills that will give teachers raises and will do other things. And if Stein vetoes it, they'll say, hey, we were gonna give you raises. Stein was the one who vetoed the bill. So that'll be interesting to see. And I think the budget will probably be the first test.
I like that last part. That's some really good insight, really good analysis. Can't think of anybody, can you, that would give a better presentation than that about the political landscape post-election. Thank you so much. I did misspeak a little bit when I said that AIR was going to be handling things directly. I mean, essentially what there's been is a process of reimbursement. We still need you. We still want you to come. We still want you to be involved, and you know, the more resources that we have, the more we can invite some really top-notch speakers that we like Mitch. And with that, I will see you in January. Have a wonderful holiday. Thank you very much.